to be here and to talk to people all over the world. It's, as Rick was saying, one of the nice discoveries of this very difficult period has been that we can do this and that we can talk to one another and have intellectual exchanges with people disseminated all over the place. So it's a real pleasure to speak to you today. I'm going to share a PowerPoint screen, and I hope that's going to work. Maybe Rick or Amelia could give me a sign if it doesn't. There we are. So I hope now you should be able to see a screen.
Yes, we can.
With the title of my talk. Okay, great, wonderful. So my title comes from a letter written in 1892 by a mother of four to the Notes and Queries section of the Parents' Review, a periodical published by an organisation established to support parents educating their children at home. This letter featured in a section of the review which functioned as a sort of 19th century Mumsnet, where parents asked for help and advice and just vented their anxieties and frustrations about the challenges of homeschooling. I've been researching the Parents' Review and its founder, Charlotte Mason, for some time. And as you can imagine, I found that research acquired a new relevance in April this year. I want to talk today about some of my work on Mason and the Parents' Review and what it might tell us about the history of education, about what we define as education, and about the role parents play in education. I think there might be some things that resonate with those of you who've had to help children with their learning at home over the past few months. So, since the 17th century, a growing body of advice literature, educational treaties and policy documents has been encouraging parents to play an active part in the education and instruction of their children. Current educational research also draws attention to the role of home and family in education, even when children are at school, noting the impact that family culture can have on educational outcomes. In some families, these ideas and other factors have led parents to withdraw their children from institutional schooling altogether. That's an option that was kind of ratified and consolidated by the 1944 Education Act, but which is actually illegal in some other parts of Europe, including in Germany, and we could talk about why in discussion if that's of interest. And the number of children being educated primarily at home, since 1944 has been growing, rising in the UK from about 20 families in 1977 to 55,000 children in 2019. That's before lockdown. That a substantial number of children are being home educated in this country at the moment. As a historian of education, amongst other things, I've long been interested in the way in which societies expect children to be socialised, and in particular in the relationship between families and education. Most work in my field, however, has focused on educational institutions, on policy, on schools and schooling. But if you think about it, in the past, home education, not school education, was the norm for the vast majority of families. In Britain, until the mid-19th century, only a small minority of children attended schools. It was not until 1880 that schooling was made universally compulsory, and it was not until 1945 that secondary schooling was systematically provided and funded. Now I'm going to show you a graph, and in the process I'm going to realise that I've missed a slide, this is a slide showing you the cover of the Parents' Review, which is where my quote comes from. I'll come back to it in a minute, but now I want to talk about this graph. So this is a graph showing you rising levels of adult literacy in the 19th century. And as you can see, the numbers of people learning to read and write were rising significantly throughout this period, but significantly were rising before the extension of formal education. So already in 1841, about 50% of women and about 70% of men were able to read and write. And that's well before the Forster Act of 1870, which started the process of establishing a national system of primary education in this country and led to the building of lots of board schools like this one. So what this graph shows, in effect, is that a lot of teaching, a lot of learning was happening outside schools and was happening at home. For elite and middle class families, that might mean governesses and tutors teaching children at home. But homes lower down the social scale were also centres of education, And there's been some really interesting work recently using prison records to uncover the ways in which the children of the labouring poor learned not only how to read and write, but also received domestic training and occupational training at home. So the home was a serious educational centre in the 19th century, and education was not synonymous with schooling for most of the period. So one of the things I'm interested in is understanding how, over the course of the 1830s to the 1950s, roughly, that changed. And people came to think of education as something with a clear beginning, a clear end point, which happened to a particular subset of the population determined by age, in institutions distinct from home and under the direction of trained professionals. That is something that we take for granted today, but it's something that had to be invented, and that's something that had to be legislated for to extend it to the whole of the population. So, of course, the processes whereby modern Britain became a schooled society also reflect changing attitudes to childhood, changing attitudes and practices of industry and labour, and notably a decline in formalised child labour, and the changing role of the state. But they also reflect a change in the understanding of what education is and what parents' role in that education should be. And one of the ways I explore these changes is by focusing on Charlotte Mason, there she is, and the parents who clustered around her. And that's Charlotte Mason as a young woman, and then as an older and very respected elder stateswoman of the home education movement. So who was Charlotte Mason? Well, today she's much better known in the States than in Britain. There, she's frequently cited as an inspiration by members of the growing homeschooling movement, and you can see some examples here of the way in which Charlotte Mason is appearing in homeschooling materials on websites and in published materials as well. And when I talk about the homeschooling movement, I mean a self-conscious movement of parents and families who seek to educate children at home in preference to sending them to an institution. So they're opting out of institutional education in a very self-conscious way. In Britain, by contrast, although Mason is so well known in the US, she's largely been forgotten. However, at the time of her death, Mason was considered by the Times to have had a personal influence, quote, probably more widespread than that of any educationist of her time. In her numerous publications, most famously Home Education, which she published in 1886, Mason had developed an attractive and popular philosophy of education. And this philosophy, which she claimed to derive from her own observation and experience, was founded on, quote, the somewhat obvious fact that the child is a person with all the possibilities and powers included in personality. Now, that seems sort of self-evident to us is partly a tribute to how influential Mason's ideas were. Those ideas that education should be centered on the child, that should be tailored to the individual child and their capacities and personality, is something that Mason was really key in establishing as part of British educational thought. There were many other people who had ideas along those lines, like Froebel, who established the kindergarten movement, or Maria Montessori, but Charlotte Mason was really important in establishing that in the British education system. And she's working in a context in contrast to the kind of hard times grad grind school of very mechanical educational instruction that was characteristic of the early Victorian period. So Mason is really emphasizing child-centered learning. Not much was known about her early life, but for our purposes, the key facts are that having trained as a teacher in the 1860s, she became an infant school teacher, and then in 1873 joined a new women's teacher training college as a lecturer. Then in 1885 she had to withdraw from that position as a result of illness, but she was then asked to give a series of lectures on the role of parents in home education, which she published as Home Education. Following this, she recalled that a few persons met in a neighbouring drawing room to discuss a scheme for a parents' educational union. By 1892, these few persons had established the Parents' Review, so this journal, and I like this image, which echoes the one you've seen earlier, because it shows the kind of seriousness of the journal. They've gone to great trouble. It's not just a sort of a cheap production. They've created this elaborate design with these mottos and a really kind of formal production that emphasizes its educational seriousness. And at the same time, it is a commercial enterprise. Mason made her living by selling these publications. So she's got to sell the advertising, but also she's selling advertising in a particular way because this journal is aimed at parents who are at home who are concerned with education in a kind of lofty way, but also concerned with more prosaic matters like how to strengthen your soup and make savoury sauces with your Bovril. So I quite like the juxtaposition that we see here. So they'd established the Parents' Review. They'd established an innovative correspondence course for children that was initially known as the Parents' Review School. And they'd established a course of instruction for mothers known as the Mother's Education Course. They'd also established a formal federal structure and declared themselves a national body, the Parents' National Educational Union, which still exists and may be known to some of you as the PNEU. So by 1897, there were 31 branches nationwide and almost 2,000 members, and there were prospects of new branches being established in Belgium, in India, and in Natal. From 1900 to 1923, the focus of the PNEU shifted somewhat, with more branches being set up through the British Empire. And it's interesting, when I talked about this work, I've discovered quite a lot of people of an older generation who were themselves brought up overseas with parents in the colonies who were educated according to the Charlotte Mason system. So there was, from the 1900s, they were focusing on establishing schools across the empire or establishing branches across the empire. And there was also a concerted effort to introduce PNEU methods into mainstream institutions. Today, schools describing themselves as PNEU institutions still exist, and the World Education Service still offers correspondence following the model of the original Parents' Review School, but obviously it's online now, as you might expect. So in the late 19th century, the PNEU was largely an elite and upper middle class association, and Mason clearly assumed a leisured audience. In home education, she expected that her readers would have a governess, and with any luck, a trained governess to work with. In fact, she clearly assumed that the families she was writing for were part of society. Thus, in 1890, a meeting of the Executive Committee of the PNEU was delayed until October so that it would be convenient for families returning to town for the winter season. As late as 1922, she expressed pleasure at the large number of families attending the PNEU's annual conference, notwithstanding the season. She also made much of her patrons among the landed gentry and aristocracy. The Countess of Aberdeen became president of the society in 1892, and titled new members were frequently referred to by name in the annual reports. This was partly good publicity, but my research suggests it did also reflect the actual makeup of the society. Many of the 30 women I've traced who took part in the Mother's Education course in its early years were the wives of peers or large-scale businessmen. Many had homes in London and the countryside, as you'd expect if they followed the season, and they had an average of 3.5 servants, and some of them had much larger households. However, the archives also reveal a steady flow of members from provincial cities and rural areas. Among them, a sort of significant proportion of vicars' wives who clearly struggled to keep up with the work that the course involved, whilst juggling many other responsibilities without the help of a fleet of servants. Thus, Ethel T. Matthews wrote from a vicarage in Monmouthshire in about 1903 to say that she could not take the Mother's Education course exam, saying, "I think you will realise a little of my difficulty when I tell you I have 3 little children, the eldest 4, the baby 16 months. I have only a young nurse, which means a great deal of the care of the children falls to me. And then after I've done their sewing of an evening, or when I can fit it in, so many tasks for the vicarage. My husband has the care of 11,000 people, nearly all poor, and one finds no time to spare to oneself." Similarly, in the letter to the Parents' Review from which I took my title, the mother of 4 asked how is a mother to fulfil all her duties. She described her day in detail. "In the morning, I have to arrange the meals, etc., dust the drawing room, attend to the plants, take charge of the children while the nurse tidies the night nursery, and teach the 2 elder children. Then I must practice with the eldest boy, who learns the violin. When the weather is fine, the children go out for about 2 hours before dinner, and I have that time as a rule to myself. After dinner, I go to the nursery while the nurse dines, and at 5:30 we commence to put the babies to bed. Besides doing these things, which I regard as absolute duties, I'm very fond of music and painting, and must read to keep abreast of the times, and I have many social duties to perform. The nurse and I also make all the children's clothes. I can truly say I am sometimes distracted. I'm sometimes almost distracted. The replies coming in from other parents in the next issue suggested early rising as a solution, or employing a very cheap seamstress, and better self-government. I found that reply particularly unhelpful and unfriendly and unsympathetic to this woman who's so distracted. Clearly, these readers were not impoverished, but they were well used to managing a middle-class family and middle-class cultural aspirations on a fairly limited income by middle-class standards, and they lived lives far removed from those of the titled ladies who followed the season. What my research suggests is that what these women and their families, from Lady Aberdeen to Ethel Matthews, had in common was a particular demographic profile and a shared sense of their need for training as parents. These women had smaller families than the average for their class and seemed to be starting their families relatively late, with an average age of 30 at the birth of their first living child. It may be that as older mothers, they were less able to draw on the expertise of the previous generation, and were thus particularly attracted by the advice that the PNEU might offer. Mason and the members of the PNEU drew on the language of education and expertise in order to unite this potentially rather disparate community. While playing up at certain times the society connections of her members, Mason more often described her audience as educated families. This emphasis was not only a way of identifying the organisation's core constituency, it also reflected the emphasis of Mason and her publications on the notion of parenthood as requiring education, training and qualification. The late 19th century saw the proliferation of publications on child psychology and physiology, and the appearance of a growing body of secular literature advising parents on the care of their offspring. And from the 1880s, there was an increasing emphasis on the need for trained and feminized care, especially for younger children. The PNEU clearly drew on this language and this movement, and was responding in part to parental demand for more knowledge and understanding of the new sciences of childhood. Mason's starting point in home education was to suggest that mothers would benefit from a knowledge of the general principles of education, founded upon the nature and needs of all children, that is, the science of education. And the Parents' Review included articles on hygiene, on the psychology of children, on discussions of diet, physical exercise and curriculum. In her writings, Mason made much of what she'd learned from Herbert Spencer, from William Carpenter and other scientific experts on child development, asserting with confidence that the old traditions that had been handed down had been found wanting as a result of the advances in science. This approach evidently held considerable appeal to those who read and contributed to the Parents' Review, and those who joined the Mother's Education course. The course in itself required a fairly serious commitment to a programme of reading and testing over 3 years, followed by a stiff examination. And here is the examination paper, which I hope you'll be able to set yourself and pass with flying colours. The exam involved writing answers to questions such as, would you present the results of modern research as proving the truth of the Bible? And describe the structure and functions of the skin. It was quite serious, hard-going stuff. Perhaps it's not surprising that many subscribers failed to complete their examinations, some because of the pressures of their domestic responsibilities. That said, the registers do record a steady stream of mothers receiving favourable comments upon their papers. Thus, in about 1893, Maud Rope, the wife of a farmer in Suffolk, submitted exam papers which were considered excellent work in both cases, showing experience, intelligent observation, practical knowledge and careful study of textbooks. And she managed this while raising 8 children with just 1 nurse, and despite her complaints about the difficulty of getting hold of books like Dr. Schofield's Hygiene and Carpenter's Mental Physiology in rural East Anglia. For all Mason's emphasis on the science of education, however, part of her appeal was her rather folksy and homespun style, which counterbalanced the emphasis on the modern in her discussion of educational science, and which reassured parents of the important role they might play in their children's education. The Parents' Review balanced erudite articles and discussions with less forbidding pieces, claiming to be by a mother. Articles deliberately set out to explain in common language what the key principles of educational philosophy were, without too much jargon, and the Parents' Review included very practical advice on how to manage the home, the schoolroom, and children's behaviour. At the same time, there was a lot of emphasis on the importance of learning from nature and children learning for themselves in a kind of imagined pastoral idyll that was a far cry from the realities of most children's lives in that period. And I noticed, I don't know if you did too, that during lockdown, when there was quite a lot of coverage of homeschooling in the media, there was a lot of emphasis on these kind of idyllic images of learning in the garden or through climbing trees and running about, splashing in streams and that kind of thing. That theme is very present in the way in which people think about home education today still. At the same time, while offering parents a comfortable way to engage with educational theory, Mason also responded to certain pressing concerns of her middle-class audience. And one of the most frequently recurring themes of mothers' letters to Mason and to the journal was a sense of anxiety about the demands of domestic life and the letter writer's lack of expertise or ability to cope. Gertrude Perfect wrote from Devon, emphasising the value of Miss Mason's books because she had been feeling completely baffled in the application of these ideas to the little emergencies of everyday life in the nursery. These were mothers who were deeply aware of the new ideas circulating about education in society, and also of the importance of preparing their children to succeed in schools. And they also felt inadequate to the task, with articles advising parents on how to choose schools and also outlining possible careers for their children in the Navy, in the law, in architecture and journalism for boys, and in education only for girls, while providing information about the cost of training and the likely rewards for these occupations. The Parents' Review provided a way for middle-class and elite parents to feel confident about how they might ensure their children's futures in a world which seemed to them to be increasingly competitive and challenging. Mason and the PNEU, however, also provided a forum for parents who might want to call into question some of the dominant orthodoxies of the late 19th century in education, or who might be seeking alternatives to the most conventional public schools. And you can kind of get a sense of this from this index to the 1907 volume, where you have information about special schools, information about schools which departed slightly from the very standard public school model, and then a kind of critique of education as an instrument for deadening the human intellect. So this is part of the kind of countercultural side of the Parents' Review and of homeschooling, which echoes some of what we see in the homeschooling movement at the moment. The Parents' Review contains some quite spirited exchanges between parents, but also between parents and some professional educators and specialists who contributed articles to the journal. Thus, in July 1890, IJ responded angrily to an article by Dorothea Beale, the headmistress of Cheltenham Ladies' College, who was by then one of the leading figures in English girls' education. She'd written an article on punishment and discipline. Miss Beale was very wrong, IJ contended, to suggest that young children should be so severely disciplined, and she particularly criticised the notion that a child under the age of 1 might be branded a thief for taking something they'd been told not to. Other articles criticised the classical curriculum of the public school and emphasised the need for scientific and modern language education for boys. Similarly, while the gender politics of Mason's publications and the Parents' Review were quite conservative, with a presumption that mothers were most responsible for the education of young children and that women's role was principally domestic, the correspondence pages reveal that some readers were also developing rather different approaches. Several articles emphasise the importance of fathers in their daughters' education, and quite a few letters give a sense of both parents as reading and discussing the contents of the review and sharing responsibility for the education of children in the home. Some correspondents were also quick to challenge the implications of conservative articles. The 1907 volume thus contains a furious letter from Agnes Grove of Bedford Square, complaining about an article on punishment in which a boy was punished by being made to wear girls' clothes. This, Grove asserted, was imbecile and impertinent, because the punishment lay in the idea that dressing as a girl was humiliating. She went on to say that the punishment laid in the boy a fertile seed, the inevitable fruit of which would be contempt for women. It was insistence upon sex at an age when there should be no sense of sex. The ignorant, smug self-satisfaction with which this example is advanced for our edification, without a qualm or a doubt as to its perfect wisdom, is an illustration of the enlightened spirit in which our unfortunate boys are educated. Then there are hypocritical and hysterical moanings over the way prostitution flourishes in this civilized country of ours. For Agnes Grove, as for some in the contemporary homeschooling movement, home education was a way to reject the values of mainstream society and to try and envisage a very different way of raising their children, challenging in ways that seem quite contemporary the kind of gendered assumptions of the early 20th century Britain. Letters like those of Agnes Grove and the general tenor of the correspondence in the Mason archives shed light on this cohort of elite and middle-class parents which sought actively to engage with current educational thinking, but also, sometimes rather uncertainly, sought to claim their own expertise as parents. And yet they also highlight a general sense of anxiety about their children's future and a sense of parents desperately trying to find ways to intervene in their children's destinies at a point when increasingly they were becoming the province of professional teachers, institutions, competitive examinations and formalized recruitment processes. Reading the Parents' Review, I've been struck by the mix of anxiety and aspiration that infuses many of the letters and articles it contains. The emotional tenor of that publication hints, I believe, at one of the reasons for the success of Charlotte Mason's ideas and of the PNEU more generally. Without being entirely coherent about it, she managed to articulate the desire of many parents to provide for their children in ways that would assure them of the character so prized in Victorian culture and allow them to share in that intellectual, social and moral world, whilst also taking account of the material realities and competitiveness of daily life in the late 19th century. I have a suspicion that many of those who suddenly found themselves needing to develop a new expertise in phonics or GCSE algebra earlier this year might find that their homeschooling looked a bit less like this or this and looked a bit more like this. They had a lot in common with 19th century parents of the Parents' Review who found themselves almost distracted by their task. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. It's fascinating material there. Well, it's time now for questions. And while people are beginning to